I've been really struck today by the response from the Prime Minister, going back actually looking at what key politicians in the cabinet, in His Majesty's government, actually said immediately after the attack at Southport, and actually looking at some of the responses from legal figures, some of whom who have advised governments in the past, especially on terror legislation, who've come out and said, I think the Prime Minister got this wrong. I don't think he did have to cover it up like he has. And the Prime Minister says, they'll leave no stone unturned. Do you have any confidence that he didn't cover all of this up primarily because he didn't want to stir up community tensions? Exactly the same argument that was used to cover up the grooming gangs, I think, has covered up what Axel Rudakambana actually did in Southport in July of last year. Here's a bit of what Keir Starmer had to say. Then I want to go back in time and show you what Angela Rayner said about Nigel Farage, who said that this had actually a lot of questions needing to be answered that could have been answered at that time, and kept us all in the loop. Here's what the Prime Minister had to say today.
I have Paul. Can I have Paul Brand, please, from ITV?
Paul Brand from ITV. Thank you, Prime Minister. All of us, as you say, as journalists, understand the risk of contempt of court, of prejudicing a trial, but we live in a different age now, don't we, where misinformation and disinformation spreads at lightning speed online. I was in Southport on the day of the attacks. There was a short window in which information could have been released before charge, before any risk of prejudicing a trial. Why didn't you do that? And do you think it was a mistake not to provide that detail then?
Firstly, let me address part of your...
Prime Minister, sorry to labour this point, but I think it's important. All summer we were repeatedly told that the Stockport attack was not terror-related, it wasn't being treated as terror-related. That wasn't true. Because in October, this monster was charged with a terror offence. Now, information was put into the public domain then that didn't collapse the trial. It didn't jeopardise justice.
Why did they
was
wait?
Just months later. Now, you say you knew about the ricin and the Al-Qaeda bomb manual, and it was known to the authorities. Did you know about that personally? At the same time, the public, the press, and you and the police were saying this is not terror-related, because I think that's the nub of the issue, and that's what's upset people. You say you couldn't speak out publicly, that you couldn't do that, but didn't the public have a right to know, not least the neighbours who had ricin being produced on their street? Surely they had a right to know.
Well, I think there are two separate and important issues there, Harry. The first is on the question of terrorism and what constitutes terrorism.
Well, he goes on to actually argue that, in the current law, it doesn't constitute terrorism. But my friends, there is form for revealing the bare-bone facts about a case to keep the public in the loop and aware and up to speed. In the Parsons Green attack of 2017, police said that they'd identified the bomber, and detectives identified the terrorist attacker who planted an explosive which went off on a packed tube train. A major manhunt was underway, and they said Islamic State claimed it was behind the attack, and Scotland Yard were confident that they identified the person involved, and those specifics were given. So bare-bone specifics were actually given at that time. Nick Timothy, an MP, he was in number 10 with Theresa May, and he said he was prevented from asking the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary were they informed that Rudakambana possessed ricin and an Al-Qaeda training manual before the trial, and he's tabled questions due to be answered this Friday coming. He had tried to ask questions and he was told he couldn't in the House of Commons. He said that there was a window to actually update people on the facts of the case. He says, I worked for a Home Secretary and a Prime Minister and know what happens when an act of terrorism occurs. The Prime Minister and Home Secretary are briefed in almost real time. Starmer was undoubtedly immediately told of the discoveries of ricin and a terrorist training manual in Rudakambana's home. And he confirmed, I knew the details as they were emerging. That is the usual practice. Yes, so why didn't you tell us that he'd been found with an Al-Qaeda manual and ricin, right? As Harry Cole from The Sun said in that clip there, the neighbours surely even have a right to know about the fact that some absolute fruitcake has just been building an explosive or some form of poison in their next door or in their neighbourhood. And legal figures coming out today to actually argue that the definition of terrorism, other lone wolf cases have been announced in the past. In 2017, the London Bridge attacker was a lone wolf attack. In 2008, in Exeter, there was the attempted explosive by some nut job who had converted to Islam. And he was a lone wolf attack, actually converted to extremist Islam and sent off the deep end and tried to do what he did. But that was a lone wolf attack. We know of these things. We've known for many years. So Jonathan Hall, KC, who has advised the government on terror legislation in the past, he was really interesting, I thought, in what he had to say about the government's ability to actually update us and whether or not they should have done.
What do you think this morning? Was it a conspiracy or was it a cock-up?
Well, I suspect that it was advice from the CPS. The effect was disastrous, so I've got no doubt about this, that more information should have been put into the public domain. And I think there was a very, very poor 8 hours after the immediate attack where social media went completely mad. And it was really up to the authorities, I think, to give a calm, sober, honest and authoritative account of what they could say. The contempt of court rules, they are difficult. And I know that journalists find them hard, but frankly, this man was only ever going to be convicted of murder or manslaughter. And it really is hard to see why more information couldn't have been given to the public. They were crying out for it. I mean, I was desperate to know when I was on holiday. I heard about the terrible attack. Of course, I wanted to know who was doing it. And there was a long period where nothing was said. So I think that how the CPS, how the police, how the authorities approach giving information when these terrible attacks occurs has to be thought about in the new social media age. Just saying nothing is no longer an option.
What do you think, Jonathan Hall, should have been said in the wake of the murders that might have stopped the riots?
I don't know what was in the minds of the rioters, but name, background, ethnicity, what they could say about whether he was acting alone, the fact that if this was the case, counterterrorism police were investigating, but they didn't know at that stage whether or not it was a terrorist attack, all things the public wanted to know. And it's very hard to see, frankly, that any of that would have made a difference to the fairness of the trial, whether he had come in on a small boat, whether he was born here. These were all the questions that were being addressed by the social media lies. And I don't think any of those would have prejudiced the trial at all.
So the original conspiracy theory that Angela Rayner calls it, but the original claim that he was a boat migrant or whatever came up from some fella in Pakistan who posted from some fake news website, and that erupted. Starmer could have nipped this in the bud long before that got off the ground. And then all he did was stoke up the riots and stir the pot. But here's what Angela Rayner had to say at that time. Watch this and evaluate whether or not you think actually, knowing that they would have known by this point, right? She's Deputy Prime Minister. They would have known by this point. She sits around the cabinet table, and this is what she had to say about Nigel Farage for saying that there are questions that need to be answered here.
I've had my issues with Nigel Farage. In previous elections, you can find footage of me taking Nigel Farage on about that poster that he did that time, you know, trying to stir up...
With the row of people behind him.
With the row of people, trying to stir up problems and troubles.
No, he wasn't. It's true.
And he's an MP now.
And that is the point, really. As a member of Parliament, he must understand that you have a level of responsibility. You're a community leader. You're elected to represent your constituency, and therefore you have a level of responsibility with that. And it's not to stoke up what conspiracy theories or what you think might have happened, or lean it into what you think. Actually, there's a responsibility to say the police are doing a difficult job. Local authorities, all of the services that are on the ground, we want to establish facts as soon as possible.
Conspiracy theories. Well, Angela Love, if they were conspiracy theories, then you had a duty to come out and say, actually, a lot of the stuff that I've been reading online isn't true. Here are the facts. Instead, what you did was watch people at boiling point go out to the streets in sheer frustration. They vote time and again for immigration controls. They don't get it. They see terror attacks happen in their country. They see rape gangs in their country. They feel utterly powerless. And all that you people did was dismiss them as conspiracy theorists, is to say that actually the fact of the matter is people like Nigel Farage are stirring up racial hatred and tension, and then to argue that they don't have a right to know. Well, they did have a right to know. There was a period, a window, before anyone had been charged, in which you, as the government, could have actually told people what was going on, who it was, what the facts on the ground were, without going into every minutiae detail of what happened, the events that took place on that night. But you can give us broad brush strokes and still maintain a fair trial. I just don't buy this. I've been inundated with messages from screaming lefties, a bit like this horrible walrus on LBC here, who actually argue virtue signalling cow that she is. But look, the fact of the matter is, we are constantly told, and I was told, I've been told over the last 24 hours, that I would have jeopardised a fair trial. No, I wouldn't. I would have made people understand what was going on in their own country, make them aware of what had just happened, what we know, the facts of the individual, without actually prejudicing anything in that regard. And then not release the information on the terror charge, which they still said wasn't a terror charge, by the way, until October. This is conspiratorial. I'm sorry. Well, it's not conspiratorial because it's bloody true. It was true that actually this was a cover-up to not stir up tensions. But here's what Stephen Barrett, the legal lawyer, had to say as well. He's a legal lawyer. Obviously, if he's in the legal profession, he may well be a lawyer. But he's a real legal mind who writes for The Spectator and other magazines. And this is what he had to say on it.
So why was information released in October that could have been released straight away? The Prime Minister today admitted he knew at the beginning it was a choice to keep it quiet. And the question's being asked, did that choice further add tensions which exacerbated these riots?
Well, we in the country have a massive problem because we have a Prime Minister and we can't trust a word he says. And we have a Prime Minister and we can't trust a word he says because he is now saying, oh, look, I may have lied to you, but I did it for your own good. You know, I did it for a good reason. It's complete top.
No, it was for his good.
Information's going to come out because I've spoken to victims and survivors and they want to talk. They're currently being traumatized, Martin. The police are going around telling them, no, you can't talk. And because they're decent people, and this is a point I like to make, we live in a broken society where laws only apply to decent people. You know, that boy was stopped 10 times and they never did anything. He was to prevent 3 times. They didn't do anything. You know, but the good people who obey laws and who want to follow them are being silenced and they must speak. We are repeating the same old mistakes. We refuse to be governed well. It's heartbreaking to watch the United States suddenly be governed by somebody who actually knows what he's doing and what he wants to achieve, and for us to be floundering in this mess. I don't think that this inquiry will work as a cover-up. The real question, Martin, is going to be who caused those riots, and I think Keir Starmer caused that riot. If you've talked to survivors, then you know, I bet you will have picked it up on this. The one thing they always talk about is 19 seconds. That's what they say. So if you go to Southport, they talk about 19 seconds because in their view, that's how long the Prime Minister took to lay down a wreath. And they don't say lay down a wreath. They often say throw down a wreath. And then he ran away being heckled by one of the and by somebody connected to the tragedy. And, you know, and that is just awful. Of course he fanned those flames. I said that all they cared about was managing it. And Starmer had one of his MPs publicly attack me on Twitter, and I had a nightmare time. It wasn't pleasant at all, Martin. I'll tell you about that. And a month later in September, his own senior advisor on counterterrorism told him that, you know, what he used a very diplomatic phrase, an information gap fan the flames, you know, and that's what's happened. And it's because he wants to treat us like children, and he wants to be able to lie to us. Well, I don't want a prime minister who treats me like a child and who lies to me. I'm a serious grown-up individual, and I don't want children hurt, and I have every right to demand answers when children are hurt.
Very well said, I thought, from Stephen there. The fact of the matter is, he's right to say that 10 times, you know, this kid caught trying to go play silly buggers with a knife, 3 times reported to the Prevent programme, still nothing was done from the authority level. These are all things that they could have told us, right? These are all things that could have been said at the time, but they weren't. They were kept from us. And Stephen's also right to say that Sir Keir Starmer started the riots. I think he did, and I think he probably quite enjoyed it, being able to bang up what he calls far right and what Angela Rayner calls conspiracy theorists. It's no conspiracy. The cover-up was real. The cover-up happened, and it's still happening now. And that's, if I do say so myself, that ought to be the point that you take away tonight. That actually, you know, you've just seen in President Donald J. Trump, President 45 and 47, that actually he's pardoned those who were found guilty of, sedition and all sorts of other things on January 6th, which is when the Capitol building was stormed. And I think actually those who have been banged up during the riots that took place in July last year, I do see not in all cases, but in a fair few of them, that actually there were people banged up for tweeting things like, believe me, this person will not, when the light of day is seen, this person will not be a Christian, right? I can guarantee that. And, you know, I don't think in any reasonable way, shape or form, although they said they couldn't find a motive behind why he did this, that if you're looking up former terror attacks by Muslim Islam extremists and child massacres several times to get you reported to the Prevent programme, that you're some law-abiding, God-fearing Christian. It just, I think we need to, in our own way, pardon many of those who've been banged up. I think that's what ought to happen. It won't happen under Sir Keir Starmer, but he's the one that started these riots. He stirred it up. So, you know, I'm just absolutely amazed, and I agree with those legal professionals that have come out today and said that he could have said more without prejudice in a fair trial. When have they ever cared about that before? When it suits them? But it didn't suit him. He didn't want to stir up community tension, exactly the same thing that happened that kept the rape gangs going. I think this has been totally covered up, and I think actually we're starting to get the facts, and I can't stand it. I really can't stand it.